a photograph shows up in a newspaper from Lebanon. It's just another wedding picture tucked into the social section. There's a groom with a smile on his face, his bride beside him, and guests who are celebrating in some garden located somewhere in Lebanon. The caption that runs with it is standard, naming the couple along with their families. There's nothing unusual about it, nothing that would catch anyone's attention except maybe friends and relatives who want to see if they ended up in the paper. But down in a basement office located in Tel Aviv, there's an intelligence analyst who studies newspapers written in Arabic, and he stops. He's staring at one particular face in the background of this wedding photo. It's not the bride he's looking at, and it's not the groom either. It's a guest who's standing a bit apart from the main group, someone who's partially hidden by other people, someone who's caught mid-conversation with a person outside the frame. The analyst reaches out for a magnifying glass, and then he reaches for a file folder, one that's thick with surveillance photographs and biographical information. He starts comparing the face from the newspaper to images that have been collected over years of patient intelligence gathering. 30 minutes of examination pass, and then he picks up a secure phone and makes a call. That call will set in motion one of the most intricate tracking operations Mossad has ever undertaken. The face in the photograph, it belongs to Imad Mughniyeh, who is Hezbollah's chief of operations. He's also one of the most wanted terrorists anywhere in the world. This is a man who has been invisible for 20 years. A ghost who's responsible for bombings, for kidnappings, for assassinations that have killed hundreds. He's a master of operational security, someone who never appears in public, who never allows photographs, and who moves through the Middle East the way smoke moves through a keyhole. And now, all because someone forgot to check who was standing in the background of a wedding photo, Mossad knows something it hasn't known in years. Imad Mughniyeh is alive. He's active. And he's confident enough to attend social gatherings. He looks older now, heavier, different enough from the last confirmed photograph that he believed himself to be unrecognizable. But intelligence agencies, they don't rely on memory. They rely on databases, on facial recognition software that was being developed back in the 1990 seconds, and on analysts who are trained to recognize subtle features that remain constant even when a face ages or when someone changes weight. The curve of an ear, the spacing between eyes, the angle of a jawline. This is the story of how one single accidental photograph became the thread that Mossad followed. They followed it across borders, through surveillance networks, and into the very heart of Damascus, Syria, where Mugnia lived under the protection of Bashar al-Assad's regime. It's a story about patience that's measured in years. It's about technology that didn't yet exist being improvised from whatever tools were available. And it's about the lengths that intelligence services will go to in order to eliminate men who are deemed too dangerous to leave alive. It's about the invisible machinery of targeted assassination. And it's about the bureaucratic processes that transform a wedding photo into a death sentence, one that gets executed in the capital of a hostile state. Imad Mughniyeh was born in 1962. His birthplace was the village of Tyre Dibba in southern Lebanon. He came into a Shia Muslim family, one that had lived in the region for generations. His childhood happened to coincide with Lebanon's descent. It went from cosmopolitan prosperity straight into sectarian civil war. It was a transformation that radicalized an entire generation of young men who came of age watching their country tear itself apart. The Lebanon of Mughniyeh's youth, it was a laboratory of violence. It was a place where militias learned to operate as states within states. Kidnapping became political currency there, and the line between terrorism and legitimate resistance, it blurred beyond recognition. He was the youngest of 3 brothers. His family was religious, but they weren't particularly political. Not until circumstances forced politics upon them. His father worked as a farmer and as a small merchant. His mother raised the children in traditional Shia religious practice. She instilled values of family loyalty and religious duty, values that would later manifest in Mughniyeh's absolute commitment to Hezbollah's ideology and his willingness to sacrifice everything, including a normal life, for the cause he believed served both his faith and his people. Mughniyeh was a quiet child. He was unremarkable in school. He showed no early signs of the operational genius and ruthlessness that would later come to define his career. Teachers who remembered him said he was withdrawn. He wasn't particularly academic, but he wasn't troublesome either. He had few friends. He preferred solitude to social interaction. These were traits that would later make him ideally suited for clandestine work, the kind of work where trust had to be carefully rationed and isolation accepted as a professional necessity. The outbreak of Lebanon's civil war in 1975, that was the crucible. It forged Mughniyeh's transformation from an ordinary teenager into a militant operative. As sectarian violence escalated, and as Beirut fractured into warring enclaves controlled by different militias, young Shia men like Mughniyeh faced a choice. They could remain passive and vulnerable, or they could join armed groups that promised protection and empowerment. For many of them, the choice wasn't difficult. The Civil War, it created opportunities for young men to gain status and purpose through violence. It let them transform frustration and humiliation into action that felt meaningful even when it was destructive. By the late 1972, Mughniyeh had joined Force 17. It was a security unit within the Palestine Liberation Organization that operated in Lebanon and provided training for militants from various organizations. Force 17 specialized in close protection, in intelligence gathering, and in covert operations. These were skills that Mughniyeh absorbed with natural aptitude. His instructors, they noted his discipline. They noted his ability to remain calm under pressure. And they noted his talent for planning operations with meticulous attention to detail, the kind of detail that minimized the risk of failure. When Israel invaded Lebanon in 1982, ostensibly to destroy PLO infrastructure and create a security buffer zone in the south, the invasion inadvertently created the conditions for Hezbollah's emergence. Israeli occupation radicalized Lebanese Shia communities. These were communities that had initially welcomed Israeli forces as liberators from PLO control, but they quickly came to see them as occupiers who brought violence and humiliation. Iran, seeking to export its Islamic revolution and establish influence in the Arab world, saw opportunity in Lebanon's chaos. They dispatched Revolutionary Guard officers to organize and train Shia militants who were willing to fight Israeli forces. Mughniyeh was among the early recruits to what would become Hezbollah, the Party of God. It was a militant organization that combined religious ideology with sophisticated military and intelligence operations. Unlike the PLO, which had operated as a state within Lebanon and alienated local populations through arrogance and abuse, Hezbollah positioned itself as the authentic defender of Lebanese Shia interests. They provided social services and security while fighting Israeli occupation with tactics learned from Iranian Revolutionary Guards, guards who had experience from the Iran-Iraq War. What distinguished Mughniyeh from other militants? It wasn't ideology. Many people shared his commitment to resistance against Israeli occupation. What distinguished him was operational creativity and a willingness to employ methods that horrified even hardened guerrilla fighters. He understood that Hezbollah, when facing Israeli military superiority in conventional terms, had to fight asymmetrically. They had to use terror, not as random violence, but as psychological warfare designed to make Israeli occupation unbearable in political and human cost. His first major operation came in April 1983 when he planned the bombing of the U.S. Embassy in Beirut. A suicide truck bomb, driven by a Hezbollah operative, crashed through the embassy's front entrance and detonated. It killed 63 people, and among them were 17 Americans. The dead included the CIA's entire Middle East Directorate leadership, who were meeting at the embassy that day. The attack demonstrated that American facilities, despite security precautions, were vulnerable to determined suicide attackers who were willing to die for their cause. 6 months later, Mughniyeh orchestrated an even more devastating operation. On October 23, 1983, 2 truck bombs struck the U.S. Marine barracks and the French paratrooper headquarters in Beirut. The explosions happened within minutes of each other. They killed 241 American servicemen and 58 French soldiers. It was the deadliest single-day loss for the U.S. military since Iwo Jima. The bombings, they achieved their strategic objective. Within months, American and French forces withdrew from Lebanon. It demonstrated that even superpowers could be driven out by adversaries who were willing to accept casualties that Western democracies found politically unbearable. These operations established Mughniyeh's reputation within Hezbollah as a master of asymmetric warfare. He was someone who understood that terrorism's power lay not in body count alone, but in psychological impact and political consequences. He had forced American withdrawal from Lebanon, not through conventional military victory, but through spectacular violence that created domestic pressure for disengagement. The lesson was clear. Properly executed terrorist operations could achieve strategic objectives that conventional military action could not. Throughout the 1,980 seconds, Mughniyeh expanded his operational scope beyond bombing. He moved into kidnapping, into airplane hijacking, and into assassination. He orchestrated the kidnapping of dozens of Western hostages in Beirut. Among them was CIA Station Chief William Buckley, whose torture and death represented a profound intelligence failure for the United States. The hostage crisis became international theater, a place where Hezbollah extracted concessions and attention while demonstrating that Western citizens were not safe, not even in their own neighborhoods and compounds. In 1985, Mugnia planned the hijacking of TWA Flight 847. The flight was going from Athens to Rome. He forced the pilot to fly to Beirut, where hijackers held 153 passengers hostage for 2 weeks. They murdered U.S. Navy diver Robert Stetham. They dumped his body onto the tarmac to demonstrate their seriousness. The hijacking became global news. It humiliated the Reagan administration and demonstrated Hezbollah's reach beyond Lebanon's borders. What made Mughniyeh particularly dangerous was his operational security. Unlike many terrorist leaders who sought publicity and recognition, Mughniyeh remained invisible. He avoided photographs. He rarely appeared in public. He changed residences frequently. And he compartmentalized operations so thoroughly that even Hezbollah members often didn't know they were working for him. His security consciousness was paranoid, but it was justified. He understood that visibility meant vulnerability and that intelligence services hunted men whose faces and patterns they could identify. By the early 1,990 seconds, Mughniyeh had become Hezbollah's chief of external operations. He was responsible for planning attacks against Israeli and Western targets worldwide. He relocated to Damascus, operating under the direct protection of Syrian intelligence services. These services used Hezbollah as a proxy force against Israel while maintaining plausible deniability. His network extended across Europe, across South America, and across the Middle East. He was coordinating cells that could execute operations on his command. Syrian President Bashar al-Assad's regime provided Mughniyeh with protection that went beyond mere tolerance. Syrian intelligence officers facilitated his movements within Damascus. They provided secure communications infrastructure, and they ensured that Western intelligence services could not operate freely in the Syrian capital. For Mughniyeh, Syria represented a sanctuary far safer than Lebanon, where Israeli penetration of Hezbollah's networks remained a constant threat despite the organization's territorial control in the south. In Damascus, surrounded by the Syrian security apparatus and insulated from Israeli intelligence reach, he believed himself beyond assassination's range. The calculation was strategic for both parties. Syria gained plausible deniability for Hezbollah operations that advanced Syrian interests while avoiding direct confrontation with Israel. Mughniyeh gained a secure base of operations in a capital city where he could coordinate international networks without the constant security pressures he would face in Beirut. The arrangement worked because both parties benefited. Syria maintained its proxy warfare capability, and Mughniyeh operated from a location where state protection made him virtually untouchable. The 1,992 bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires killed 29 people and injured hundreds. 2 years later, the bombing of the Amia Jewish Community Center in the same city killed 85 and wounded hundreds more. Both operations bore Mughniyeh's signature: meticulous planning, devastating execution, and psychological impact that extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The message was clear: no Israeli facility was safe anywhere in the world. Jewish communities could be targeted even in countries thousands of miles from the Middle East conflict. Israeli intelligence had been hunting Mugnia since the 1982. His file at Mossad headquarters grew thicker each year with intercepted communications, with witness testimonies, and with forensic analysis linking him to dozens of attacks. But he remained untouchable. He was protected by layers of security, by Syrian state apparatus, by Iranian support, and by operational discipline that made him nearly impossible to locate or predict. Mossad had tried to track him through surveillance of known associates, through electronic eavesdropping, through informants within Hezbollah. All efforts had failed. Mugnia existed as a voice on intercepted phone calls, as a name in documents, but never as a physical presence that could be targeted. The Israeli intelligence community considered him an existential threat. His operations had killed hundreds, and his position coordinating Hezbollah's international network meant that future attacks were not just possible, but inevitable. Eliminating him became a priority at the highest levels of Israeli government. Prime ministers were briefed regularly on efforts to locate and neutralize Mughniyeh. Mossad's leadership devoted substantial resources to the hunt. But without knowing what he looked like now, without confirmed sightings or reliable patterns to exploit, without the ability to operate freely in Damascus where he had taken refuge, the operation remained theoretical. The challenge of operating in Damascus, it cannot be overstated. Unlike Beirut, where Mossad maintained networks of informants and could deploy operatives under various covers, Damascus was the capital of a hostile state. It had sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities inherited from decades of Soviet training, Syrian intelligence services, the Mukhabarat. They were among the most ruthless and effective in the Middle East. Any Israeli operative caught in Damascus would face torture and execution. Any assassination attempt that failed, or that could be definitively traced to Israel, would trigger an international crisis and possible military retaliation. This operational reality meant that even if Mossad could locate Mugnia in Damascus, eliminating him would require methods and resources that went far beyond typical assassination operations. It would require cooperation with intelligence services that had assets in Syria. It would require sophisticated technical capabilities that could execute remotely. And it would require absolute precision that minimized risk of exposure. It would require, in essence, a perfect operation executed in the most hostile environment imaginable. Then in 2006, after the July war between Israel and Hezbollah that devastated southern Lebanon and northern Israel, intelligence analysts intensified their review of all available material related to Hezbollah leadership. They studied newspapers published in Beirut, in Damascus, and in Tehran. They were looking for any mention of names, any photographs from events where Hezbollah figures might appear, any scrap of information that might provide leads. It was during this systematic review that the analyst found the wedding photograph. It had been published months earlier in a Lebanese newspaper's social pages. The photo showed a family celebration. The couple being married had connections to Hezbollah through family and community ties, though they themselves were not operational members. The guest list would naturally include people from Hezbollah's social network, the fighters, the political operatives, the logistics coordinators who formed the organization's infrastructure. The analyst's eye caught on one face in the photograph's background. It was a heavy-set man in his 40s. His beard was neatly trimmed. He was dressed in a dark suit. He was standing slightly apart from the main group. Something about the face triggered recognition, though the analyst could not immediately identify why. He pulled up Mossad's database of Hezbollah personnel. He started with confirmed photographs of Mugnia from the 1982, when he had been less careful about avoiding cameras. The comparison was not immediately obvious. Mugnia had aged significantly. He'd gained weight. He'd grown a fuller beard. But certain features remained constant. The spacing of his eyes, the structure of his nose, the distinctive shape of his ears. Using rudimentary facial recognition software developed for intelligence applications, the analyst ran comparisons between the wedding photo guest and archived images of Mugnia. The software identified multiple points of correspondence with high probability of match. The analyst prepared a detailed report for his superiors. He acknowledged that the identification was not certain, but he argued that the probability was high enough to warrant further investigation. If the man in the photograph was indeed Mugnia, it represented the first confirmed sighting in nearly 2 decades. More importantly, it provided context. Mugnia was confident enough to attend social events. This suggested he felt secure in his environment and had become comfortable enough that he allowed himself to be photographed, even accidentally. The report reached Mossad director Meir Dagan, who had made eliminating Hezbollah's leadership a priority of his tenure. Dagan studied the photograph and the analysis. He consulted with technical experts about the facial recognition assessment, and he made a decision. Regardless of whether the identification was certain, it was credible enough to justify launching a tracking operation. If the man in the photograph was Mughniyeh, Mossad would find him. If it was not, the operation would fail, but at minimal cost, beyond resources invested. Dagan authorized Operation Iced Coffee. The code name was deliberately chosen to reflect the patient and methodical approach the mission would require. Unlike kinetic operations that moved quickly once launched, Iced Coffee would be a surveillance operation that might take years. The objective was not immediate assassination, but comprehensive intelligence collection. Identify Mughniyeh's current appearance. Map his movements and patterns. Identify his security arrangements. Locate his residences. And compile enough information that when the decision came to eliminate him, the operation could execute with minimal risk of failure or collateral damage. The challenge was formidable. Mughniyeh operated primarily from Damascus, a city where Mossad's presence was minimal and where any surveillance operation faced extraordinary risks. Syrian counterintelligence monitored foreign nationals closely. Hotels reported guest lists to security services. Telecommunications were intercepted routinely. The Mukhabarat maintained informant networks that penetrated foreign diplomatic missions and business communities. Operating in Damascus meant accepting that discovery could result not just in operational failure, but in the capture, torture, and execution of Israeli operatives. Mossad's collections department, responsible for human intelligence gathering and surveillance operations, took operational control. They assembled a team that would need to rely heavily on technical surveillance rather than physical presence in Damascus. The approach would combine satellite imagery, signals intelligence, and carefully managed human sources who could provide information without requiring Israeli operatives to maintain continuous presence in hostile territory. The first phase involved confirming whether Mugnia was actually in Damascus and establishing basic patterns of his life there. This required activating assets who could operate in Syria without drawing suspicion. Businessmen with legitimate reasons to travel to Damascus, journalists covering Middle East affairs, academics conducting research. These assets would not conduct direct surveillance, which would be too risky. Instead, they would provide contextual information about neighborhoods, buildings, and locations where Hezbollah maintained presence in Damascus. Western intelligence services, particularly the CIA, had their own reasons for wanting Mugnia eliminated. His role in killing American servicemen and diplomats made him a priority target for multiple agencies. Quiet coordination began between Mossad and CIA regarding intelligence sharing about Mughnieh's location and patterns. The Americans had capabilities in Damascus that Israel lacked, particularly technical surveillance systems that could be deployed without requiring human presence on the ground. Over months of patient work, intelligence began accumulating. Mugnia was confirmed to be living in Damascus, primarily in the Kafr Sousa neighborhood. It was an area popular with Hezbollah operatives and under effective control of Syrian intelligence services sympathetic to the organization. He maintained at least 2 residences that he alternated between, never establishing predictable patterns that would make him vulnerable to surveillance. He traveled with minimal security. He was relying on Damascus itself as his protection rather than bodyguards who would draw attention. Technical surveillance satellites, communication intercepts, tracking devices placed on vehicles associated with Hezbollah gradually mapped his general patterns. He attended mosques for Friday prayers, though not the same mosque consistently. He met with associates at restaurants in neighborhoods controlled by Syrian intelligence. He made occasional trips to Beirut, but spent most of his time in Damascus, managing Hezbollah's international operations from the relative safety of Syrian protection. By late 2007, Mossad had compiled comprehensive intelligence on Mughniyeh's life in Damascus. The file documented his current physical appearance in detail. Weight approximately 95 kilograms, height 175 centimeters, full beard with gray streaks, glasses worn occasionally, preference for dark conservative clothing. Surveillance had identified vehicles he used, though registration information was controlled by Syrian intelligence and could not be accessed directly. They had mapped his residences and identified locations he frequented, though detailed patterns remained elusive due to the impossibility of maintaining continuous surveillance in Damascus. The intelligence picture was detailed enough that discussions began about the operational phase, elimination. But assassination in Damascus posed challenges that went beyond anything Mossad had attempted in hostile territory. This was not Beirut, where despite Hezbollah's presence, the Lebanese state was weak enough that Israeli operations could be conducted with manageable risk. Damascus was the capital of a police state with sophisticated counterintelligence capabilities. Any attack would occur in the most hostile possible environment, where Israeli operatives could not operate freely, and where any error would result in capture or death. The method had to meet multiple requirements. It had to be remotely executed, since operatives could not remain in Damascus long enough to confirm Mughniyeh's presence and execute manually. It had to be precise enough to kill Mughniyeh without causing mass casualties that would create propaganda victories for Hezbollah and Syria. It had to be technically sophisticated enough to work reliably, but simple enough that it could be installed without extended presence in the target area. And critically, it had to provide plausible deniability. If possible, the method should create ambiguity about who was responsible. The solution came from joint technical development between Mossad and CIA. A remotely detonated explosive device small enough to be concealed in a vehicle's headrest, but powerful enough to ensure lethality when Mughniyeh was seated inside or standing immediately adjacent. The device would be triggered remotely when surveillance confirmed Mughniyeh's presence, using technology that could not be traced to Israeli or American sources. The explosion would be directed inward and upward, maximizing lethality for the target while minimizing collateral damage to bystanders. Installing the device required access to a vehicle that Mughniyeh used regularly or would use predictably. This presented the operation's greatest challenge. The team identified a Mitsubishi Pajero SUV that intelligence indicated was sometimes used by Hezbollah operatives in Damascus. The vehicle was not registered to Mughniyeh. Personally, he was too security conscious for that, but signals intelligence suggested it was part of a small fleet of vehicles that Hezbollah members used when meeting in certain Damascus neighborhoods. Getting access to the vehicle required an operation within the operation. In December 2007, during a period when the Pajero was parked in a location away from heavy surveillance, a team gained access long enough to install the device in the spare tire compartment behind the rear passenger seat. The operation took less than 30 minutes. The device was activated and tested remotely to ensure functionality, then placed in standby mode, awaiting the trigger command. The waiting period began. Intelligence monitored for any indication that Mughniyeh would be using that specific vehicle. The challenge was that Syrian intelligence sometimes swept vehicles for surveillance devices, meaning the window for using the installed device was limited. If too much time passed, the device might be discovered during routine security checks. The operation existed in a state of readiness that could not be maintained indefinitely. Then in early February 2008, signals intelligence intercepted communications, suggesting that Mughniyeh would be attending a meeting in Damascus on February 12th. The location was in Kafr Sousa, the neighborhood where he felt most secure. Further intelligence suggested he might be using the Pajero for transportation that evening. The information was not certain, it never is in intelligence work, but it was credible enough that operational planners decided to prepare for execution. On February 12, 2008, surveillance assets in Damascus, a combination of technical systems and human sources at safe distance, confirmed that Mughniyeh had attended a meeting at a building in Kafr Sousa. He had arrived in the early evening and spent approximately 2 hours inside. When he emerged, He walked toward a Mitsubishi Pajero parked on a nearby street. The vehicle matched the description of the one containing the device. Surveillance confirmed he was alone. He was walking without security escort through a neighborhood he considered safe. Damascus was his sanctuary, and in this moment, that confidence made him vulnerable. He approached the vehicle appearing relaxed, perhaps preoccupied with thoughts about the meeting he had just concluded. He reached the Pajero and opened the door, preparing to enter. At that moment, operatives monitoring from outside Syria received confirmation that the target was at the vehicle. They transmitted the execute command through encrypted channels. The signal reached the device concealed in the Pajero. There was no countdown, no warning. The detonation was instantaneous. The explosion tore through the vehicle's interior with focused violence. The blast was designed to direct energy inward and upward, concentrating force on anyone inside or immediately adjacent to the vehicle. Mugnia was standing at the open door when the device detonated. The explosion killed him instantly. The force severed his head from his body. The headrest that had concealed the device was destroyed completely. The vehicle's interior was devastated, but the blast's directionality meant that damage to the surrounding area was limited. The explosion echoed through the Damascus neighborhood at approximately 10:45 p.m. local time. Residents rushed to windows. Syrian security forces arrived within minutes, sealing the area and preventing anyone from approaching. Emergency responders found Mughnieh's body beside the destroyed vehicle. The scene made clear this was no accident. The precision of the explosion, the targeting of a specific individual, the sophistication of the device, all pointed to a professional intelligence operation. Syrian authorities immediately began investigating, knowing that an assassination in Damascus represented a profound breach of security and a humiliation for the Assad regime that had promised Mugnia protection. They examined the Pajero's wreckage, searching for evidence about the device and how it had been installed. They interrogated anyone who had been near the vehicle in preceding days. They reviewed surveillance footage from cameras in the area, though the device's remote detonation meant there were no suspicious individuals present at the moment of explosion. Hezbollah's leadership received notification within hours. Their response was immediate and emotional. Mugnia had been more than an operational commander. He was a symbol of the organization's capabilities and its ability to strike Israeli and Western targets globally. His death in Damascus, under Syrian protection, sent a message that shocked Hezbollah: nowhere was safe. If Mugnia could be killed in the Syrian capital, with all the protection that entailed, then no Hezbollah leader was beyond reach. The organization announced his death the following day, February 13, 2008. They declared him a martyr and vowed revenge against Israel. Thousands attended his funeral in Beirut's Dahi district, where Hezbollah maintained control. The funeral became a massive demonstration of grief and anger, with Hezbollah supporters carrying his photograph and chanting vows of vengeance. Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's Secretary General, delivered a eulogy praising Mughnieh's decades of service and promising that his death would be avenged. Israel maintained its standard position of neither confirming nor denying responsibility. Prime Minister Ehud Olmert made no public statement about the assassination. Defense officials declined comment when asked by journalists whether Israel was involved. Mossad Director Meir Dagan said nothing publicly, though those familiar with the operation later described his satisfaction that a 2-decade hunt had finally succeeded. The international reaction was muted. Western governments that had their own reasons to want Mugnia dead expressed no sympathy for his killing, though they officially condemned extrajudicial assassinations. Syria protested the violation of its sovereignty and demanded international investigation, but received little support from countries that viewed Mugnia as a terrorist responsible for killing hundreds. The United Nations issued statements calling for restraint, but took no concrete action. The assassination's impact extended beyond Mughnieh's death. Hezbollah lost its most operationally capable commander, the architect of attacks that had killed hundreds, and the coordinator of international networks that threatened Israeli and Western interests worldwide. His successor would need years to develop equivalent operational expertise and international connections. The psychological impact on Hezbollah was profound. The organization's sense of invulnerability, particularly in Damascus, had been shattered. For Syria, the assassination was a humiliation that exposed the limits of its ability to protect assets it had guaranteed safe haven. The Assad regime had promised Mugnia security, and that promise had proven worthless against intelligence services willing to operate in Damascus despite the risks. The incident strained Syrian-Hezbollah relations temporarily, as Hezbollah questioned whether Syrian security had been penetrated or whether Syrian intelligence had failed to detect the operation's preparation. For Mossad and CIA, Operation Iced Coffee represented validation of patient intelligence work and methodical operations that prioritized precision over speed. The operation succeeded because analysts had recognized a face in a wedding photograph, because intelligence services had spent months documenting patterns and movements despite operating in hostile territory, because technical specialists had developed a weapon system that could kill with minimal collateral damage, and because operatives had executed with discipline that maintained plausible deniability. The wedding photograph that had started the operation remained in Mossad's files, a reminder of how intelligence work depends on chance as much as skill. If that photograph had not been published, if the analyst had not been reviewing that particular newspaper on that particular day, if Mugnia had noticed the photographer and moved out of frame, the operation might never have begun. The single image had provided the thread that Mossad followed for 2 years, until it led to a Damascus street where Imad Mughniyeh believed himself safe. Yet the operation also demonstrated the limits of assassination as counter-terrorism strategy. Mughniyeh's death did not end Hezbollah's threat to Israel. The organization continued operating, it adapted to his absence, and it eventually found leadership capable of maintaining its military and intelligence capabilities. Hezbollah's revenge came gradually. In 2012, operatives bombed a bus carrying Israeli tourists in Bulgaria, killing 5 Israelis and a Bulgarian driver. The cycle of violence continued, each assassination or attack feeding the next round of retaliation. The technical sophistication of the Damascus operation set a new standard for targeted killings in hostile territory. The remotely detonated device, the minimal collateral damage, the execution in a capital city under heavy security, all demonstrated capabilities that other intelligence services studied and attempted to replicate. The operation showed that with sufficient resources, technical capabilities, and patience, intelligence services could reach targets even in locations previously considered sanctuaries. The cooperation between Mossad and CIA in the Mugnia operation remained classified, but intelligence professionals understood that neither agency could have executed the mission alone. Mossad provided the motivation, the target identification, and much of the operational planning. CIA provided technical capabilities and intelligence access in Syria that Israel lacked. The partnership demonstrated that complex operations in hostile territory increasingly required cooperation between intelligence services that had complementary capabilities and shared interests. The lessons Hezbollah learned from Mughniyeh's assassination shaped the organization's operational security for years afterward. Future commanders became even more paranoid about patterns and predictability. They avoided using the same vehicles repeatedly. They varied their routes and schedules obsessively, and they implemented security measures that made surveillance exponentially more difficult. They understood that Mughniyeh's operational security had been good but not perfect, and that the wedding photograph had initiated a chain of intelligence collection that led to his death. Syrian intelligence services also learned painful lessons. The fact that Israeli or American operatives had gained access to a vehicle in Damascus, installed a sophisticated explosive device, and executed a remotely triggered assassination represented a catastrophic security failure. Syria's Mukhabarat intensified counterintelligence operations, increased surveillance of foreign nationals, and implemented more rigorous security protocols around individuals under their protection. But the fundamental reality remained. No security system is perfect, and determined adversaries with sufficient resources can penetrate any defense, given enough time and opportunity. Imad Mughniyeh's death closed a chapter in the long shadow war between Israel and Hezbollah, but it did not end the conflict. His legacy lived on in the organization he had helped build, in the methods he had pioneered, and in the networks he had established across continents. His successors studied both his operational successes and the security failures that had made him vulnerable, learning lessons that made them more difficult targets for the intelligence services that continued hunting Hezbollah's leadership. The hunt for Mugnia demonstrated what modern intelligence agencies can accomplish when they commit resources and patience to tracking individuals who believe themselves invisible. It showed that operational security, no matter how carefully maintained, eventually fails when adversaries have sufficient motivation and capability to exploit the smallest vulnerabilities. It proved that even state protection in a fortified capital offers no absolute sanctuary against intelligence services willing to accept the risks of operating in hostile territory. And it revealed that in the shadow war between intelligence services and terrorist organizations, a single photograph can become the thread that unravels years of carefully constructed invisibility. One moment of carelessness at a wedding, one background figure captured accidentally by a photographer, one analyst in Tel Aviv who recognized a face that was supposed to be unrecognizable. These small chances and observations became the foundation for an operation that reached across borders and into Damascus itself. The Mitsubishi Pajero's wreckage was eventually removed from the Damascus street. The burn marks on the pavement faded. Life in Kafr Sousa returned to its normal rhythms, but the message of February 12, 2008 remained clear to anyone in Hezbollah's leadership. Operational security is never perfect. Patterns are always vulnerable to exploitation, and the intelligence services hunting you are patient enough to wait years for the single opportunity they need. Somewhere in Mossad's archives, the wedding photograph remains filed as evidence of how the hunt began. A seemingly innocent image of celebration and family, distinguished only by one face in the background. A heavyset man in a dark suit, standing slightly apart from the crowd, captured in a moment he never knew would mark the beginning of his end. In intelligence work, where wars are fought in shadows and victories are measured in secrets revealed and targets eliminated, that photograph represents the perfect convergence of chance and capability that defines successful operations. The story of how a wedding photo led to an assassination in Damascus is ultimately a story about patience, about the incremental work of intelligence gathering that builds understanding piece by piece until the complete picture emerges. It's about analysts who examine thousands of images looking for the one that matters. About operatives who wait months in difficult conditions for brief opportunities. About technical specialists who develop weapons that can kill with precision in the most challenging environments. And about leadership willing to authorize operations that risk international crisis in pursuit of strategic objectives. Imad Mughniyeh lived by the principle that invisibility equals survival. For 2 decades, that principle protected him as he orchestrated attacks across the world. But in the end, invisibility proved to be an illusion, sustained only until someone looked closely enough at the right photograph at the right moment. In the calculus of intelligence warfare, that moment of recognition was worth more than all the security measures that had kept him hidden for years. The wedding continues in the photograph, frozen in time. The bride and groom smile for the camera, unaware that history is being made in their celebration's background. The guests raise their glasses, capturing a moment of joy and family. And standing apart, partially obscured, is the man whose presence in that frame would set in motion events leading to his death in a Damascus street 2 years later. One photograph, one face, one operation, and the invisible machinery of intelligence warfare that transforms accidents into opportunities and opportunities into eliminations.